check. Right? Right? Now, this $80,000 check goes out into the banking system. Right? It's new money. Right? When we make a loan, right? When we make a loan, the bank creates money. We talked about this when we went over it. When this bank loans part of its reserves out to the people, it makes new money. Now, the reason we said it's new money is all these people still are spending their $100,000. They're writing checks, they're spending it. This all counts as a part of M1. But now there's an $80,000 loan that's created that represents new money. So when the banks make loans, they create new money. Now, what the Fed does is make it either easier or harder for banks to make loans. Right? So we said, okay. I mean, what the Fed, ultimately what we said is if we take the total deposits that the bank has, we say, okay, how much does the bank have on total deposits? Right? And we say, all right, it has total deposits this, and we say, all right, you know, how much what's the reserve requirement? And then we have something called the required reserves. The required reserves in this case were $20,000. The total deposits was $100,000. What they're left with is what we call the excess reserves. The excess reserves are the amount that the bank can legally lend. Right? The bank can legally lend up to their excess reserves. Now, what we argued is what the Fed does is manipulate this. Manipulate bank excess reserves. How do they do it? Well, we said there are three tools that the Fed uses to manipulate bank excess reserves. One is they can alter the reserve ratio. If the reserve ratio is 20, they can make it 10. If they make it 10, then every bank in the country is going to have significantly more excess reserves. They can loan those excess reserves out. The money supply goes up. They can make it 30. If they make it 30, every bank in the country has fewer excess reserves. Then they don't loan those things out, and the money supply goes down. So they can manipulate the reserve ratio. The other thing they can do is alter the discount rate. The discount rate is the rate of interest that banks loan, or the Fed loans its member banks money at. If they raise the discount rate, it makes it harder to borrow money. The money supply goes down. If they lower the discount rate, it makes it easier for the banks to borrow money. The money supply goes up. Oh, incidentally, what's the federal funds rate? Anybody remember the federal funds? I'll ask you about this in the AP test. What is the federal funds rate? Yes. The federal funds rate is the rate of interest that banks charge each other for overnight loans. What's the difference between the federal funds rate and the discount rate? The difference between the federal funds rate and the discount rate. How's the difference? What's the difference? You gotta tell me the same. The discount rate is the rate of interest the Fed loans its member banks money at. Federal funds is the rate of interest that banks loan each other money at. Well, one is the Fed is loaning the money to the bank, and the other, the federal funds, the banks are loaning. Mellon is loaning it to PNC, that's the federal funds, overnight. Right? The discount is the Fed is loaning it to Mellon, not necessarily overnight.
Federal funds from
Bank to bank overnight.
Discounts from Fed to bank.
Right, correct, exactly. Now, the significance of the federal funds rate is that's the rate of interest that the Fed targets. They target the federal funds rate. So when they want to raise the interest rate or lower the interest rate, they target the federal funds rate. This is the rate of interest that we want to manipulate.
How was it? Was it? Thank you.
Sorry.
It's all right. Okay. Now, the biggest way the Fed manipulates the money supply is through open market operations. Now, open market operations is the Fed buying and selling bonds. So the Fed holds bonds, right? They have bonds. and they can buy bonds or they can sell bonds. If they buy bonds,
Is this for controlling excess reserves?
yes. So it's always controlling excess reserves, and excess reserves ultimately affect the money supply. So then the three ways the Fed manipulates excess reserves are: one, changing the reserve ratio; two, the discount rate; and three, open market operations. Now,
Wait, what about the federal funds rate? That's part of it.
the federal funds rate is just another rate of interest,
Okay.
right, that we threw into the conversation because it's going to be asked about, right? Now, okay, Meg, listen to this. If the Fed decides that it's going to buy bonds, right, how does that affect excess reserves? Go ahead.
It makes the money supply go up.
Correct,
So-
right? And the reason it makes the money supply goes up, if the Fed buys bonds, I have a bond, right? Is that bond money? It's not money, right? If I have a bond, it's not money. I can't take it to the bank or I can take it to the bank, but I can't take it to the grocery store and buy something with it. It's not money, correct? It's a bond, right? Now, if the Fed buys it, what do they give me? Money. What do I do with the money? Well, I can spend it or I can put it in the bank. And if I spend it, it goes to somebody, they put it in the bank. And when they put it in the bank, what happens to the deposits in bank? They go up. And when deposits in bank goes up, what happens to the excess reserves of the bank? It goes up. When the excess reserves of the bank go up, what does the bank do? Loan money up. What happens to the money supply? It goes up. So, if the Fed buys bonds, the money supply is going to increase and interest rates are going to go down. Correct? What if they sell bonds? The opposite is going to occur. Right? Okay. So now we have, right, monetary and fiscal policy. Now, granted, there's a lot more to say about both of those things. But hopefully I refreshed your memory on, aspects of monetary and fiscal policy and how they relate to this. Now, let me give you a recommendation. One of the big